Smiling was a big part of his practice. And, eventually in the beginning, it's kind of like this forced training, but what he realized was the smile could actually trigger mindfulness, because you could realize when you're not smiling anymore, your mind has probably gone into a kind of serious and negative state. And then this would be a reminder to become aware again. So for him, it was a big kind of trick on retreat to be more mindful. And he also looked in a little bit to the smiling research. There's been like over 200 studies, like a meta-analysis showed that there is a statistically significant improvement in mood from smiling. So he realized this was one way to bring joy into the practice. One of the things he realized from his own very intensive training, and it's a lesson I had to relearn over and over again, is that especially I think Westerners tend to come at the meditation practice with way too much of a serious mindset. And actually, when you look at the traditional Buddhist texts, it's all about being happy and joyful. And that's the kind of thing that brings us into the present. So a lot of people think if I meditate really hard, then I'll be happy. But actually, being happy brings you into a meditative state. And it's kind of the vehicle to get into these deeper states called jhanas. So this was one way for him to get especially more serious meditators to relax and have fun with the practice.
I love that. So like our default assumption is if I meditate more, I'll be happy. But what he's sort of saying is that it's bidirectional. If I'm happier, I'm much more conducive to a meditative state. And I love just this idea, like if you do have a practice of maintaining a smile, then whenever you notice yourself not smiling, it's a way to bring yourself back in the present moment. And as a byproduct of that, smiling, like just having your face in that posture, produces joy as a byproduct. Okay, Liam, welcome to the show. For anybody that isn't aware of you and your work, can you just give us like an overview of the journey you've been on, say maybe the past decade, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's hard to think back over a decade, but I guess I started out with a pretty standard journey in some ways for kind of I was on kind of a Western track towards finance and wanting to be successful in a material way of making money. And so that was kind of my thoughts from high school and in through college. I studied at Yale University, and I was pretty convinced I was going to go into finance, which is what my dad had worked in, and also my brother. And it was kind of the world that I grew up in, and was also maybe subconsciously believing that was the way to be happy, was to make a lot of money and get the house and the car and the all the things that kind of the American dream sells in some ways. And so I started down that more mainstream path, and after college I worked a year in private equity. And so I was exposed to a lot of kind of wealthy individuals, and the person I was working for was like a Forbes list multi-billionaire. And so I got to see that these people, even though they were very successful, they still didn't seem to be quite satisfied. And I guess that sounds kind of obvious to some people who have been studying psychology or positive psychology, that happiness doesn't come from material success, or having certain basic needs met can help us. But I guess I had to see for myself that this wasn't the path, and that it led to a lot of stress and kind of a pretty messy mind in a lot of ways. Even though I was doing the things that I was kind of told would lead to success and happiness, I was feeling, all the symptoms of just a chaotic life. I was working long hours and feeling stressed and low energy, and trying to figure things out. So I started to explore other paths, and came across meditation. And the more I read about meditation initially from kind of a scientific standpoint, I was just more and more convinced that this is what I needed and also what could really help the world. And a lot of the problems I was seeing around me with attention deficits and um, a need for more social kind of cohesion and peace of mind. And this was kind of before. I think now a lot of these, it's widely accepted, but this was a little bit before it started to go more mainstream with the meditation apps. And so I started down this path of going to retreats, going to yoga teacher training, and then starting to go on these 10-day silent Vipassana retreats and learning more about kind of the depth of the Buddhist path and other traditions that also talk about meditation as a way not just to reduce stress and start to feel more productive and healthy and kind of a mental health maintenance way, but also more started to talk about these deeper states of consciousness and how you could actually transform the mind completely into states of kind of lasting well-being and I guess what some people call enlightenment or awakening. And so that really grabbed my attention, that if this is possible to basically be happy all the time, what could be more worthwhile for a pursuit. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that happen over the journey. I don't know exactly which ones to go into now, but the brief overview is that I started FitMind, which is essentially a mental fitness and meditation training company. It's a mobile application, and I think that what I saw was there were a lot of meditation apps teaching the basics, but there wasn't really uh, any meditation apps that were teaching a systematic training program for going deeper in the practice and not just using it as a quick tool to de-stress, but also a path where you could progress and get into deeper and deeper states and start to have insights and transformative insights about how the mind works. So that was kind of the initial spark for creating FitMind, and it became a podcast. And then recently I published my first book, also called FitMind, and it's about meditating in daily life, which is, I think, the other thing that it took me a while to realize. And even as a monk, even when my teacher was telling me this over and over again, that this practice is really something that needs to be carried into every moment of the day, it took a while for that message to really sink in and for me to really understand how to do that, how to meditate all day, and that it wasn't just about when I was on the cushion or in the monastery or on retreat. So now my journey, I disrobed from being a Buddhist monk about 6 months ago, and so a lot of the last 6 months has been about reintegration and really bringing that practice into everyday life where things are busier. And that's a lot of what I wrote about, was how to bring meditation into daily life.
That's quite a journey you've been on, Liam. Something I was curious to ask you. The decision to become a monk. What was that like for you at the time? Because you're kind of going against the conventional norms of society there. You're doing something that's quite radical. Was it a difficult decision to make? And how did what helped you to make it, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of reasons I wanted to give it a try, and the main one, and I think the main purpose of being a monk, was to remove distractions so I could focus on training my mind. And I thought it was a rare opportunity to do that. And I think there were difficult parts for sure, especially for me at the time. I was worried what my friends and family would think. And in a sense, you're giving up a piece of your identity when you become a monk. So shaving my head and so looking different, being bald, being in a robe, and then they give you a Pali name in the Theravada tradition. So also losing my name in a sense. it definitely created a shift, and it was challenging to, just to think about what my friends might think, or maybe some of the stigma of just, like, I'll tell a short story. For example, I was visiting my family and I was wearing this orange robe, and it's kind of, they live in a kind of um, upper middle class suburb, and I was in a coffee shop and I ran into an old friend from high school, and I could just I knew he thought I was crazy because he didn't even ask like what I was doing in robes. so so he was just like, "Oh, good to see you," and like almost didn't want to ask, just kind of thought I'd really gone off the rails. Uh, but eventually, after enough interactions like that, and just realizing that also people don't really think or care about you as much as you might think they do, I kind of got over that part, and also just realized it was a valuable gift to be able to really take that time out of my life, and focus on training my mind and kind of exploring the depths of my mind.
How long of a period was it? How long did it last?
I was a monk for about 3 years. There was also a year where I was living at home in robes, following the monastic rules, but writing the book. And my plan was actually to, after that, to go off to back to the monastery in Asia for the rest of my life, presumably. And it was actually while I was at home writing the book that I started to um, have second thoughts and started to realize that I wanted to actually live a more conventional life, and that I could bring the practice into daily life and still kind of get where I wanted to go on my spiritual journey. Um, so yeah, in all, like, time in monasteries, like training as a monk, I would say was about 3 years.
Beautiful. And can you kind of give us a sense of the difference in your inner life now compared to before? What is it like to be Liam McClintock at this point in time?
Um, yeah, things have changed a lot. One of the biggest things that meditation does is it makes you more aware of what's happening in your mind, and eventually you can be mindful most or even all of the day, where you're always aware of what your mind and body are up to, and that in and of itself makes you much more aware of when your mind is going into a negative state, and the practice is kind of bringing it out of that, letting go of whatever has kind of tugged you into that, uh, whatever has captured your attention or your awareness, and coming back. And so uh, it's almost like, yeah, it's like an increase in percentage until you're more and more kind of in the present. And overall, I just feel way more relaxed and connected to others. I also uh, have very different priorities than I did before. I think I was driven a lot by these kind of, um, yeah, what others thought of me, and um, as I talked about on my journey, kind of thinking that success would come from the material world. So a lot of the mindset shift has been just like a deeper experiential understanding that there's no happiness outside of an inner state of well-being. So I think just also a priority shift, and that changes, I guess, the way that I go about my day and prioritize things. Um, yeah, those are some of the bigger ones. It's hard to describe sometimes, like, the way that experience has shifted, because it happens so gradually and you kind of forget where you were at before. But I can definitely remember a little bit of what it was like to be like me, like in my in here, and it was yeah, way more challenging. The day was kind of much more uh like kind of weighed down by mental baggage and stuff. It feels like I've lost like 200 pounds of mental obesity, I guess, in a way, of these kind of overweight states and past events and things that were weighing down my mind. So just a lot lighter and happier.
Yeah, like from speaking to you even this past say 20 minutes, like I can see a huge change in you. You know, it's sort of like it's something really is like kind of bubbling through you. You know, there's a real energy and aliveness there that's just you can even see it through a screen, you know. So whatever happened has been has been a big positive.
Oh, thanks.
How has this changed your relationship to motivation? You know, some people worry, you know, if they go down this path and they get really deep into meditation, it might kind of take away their drive, their edge. How do you feel now about, you know, actually getting things done and your work, etc.? Like, has it changed that at all?
Yeah. So I do think that my priorities changed and my motivations changed. Um, so I'm less motivated by the things that used to be driving me. So I do think if somebody is currently motivated by um, something that is kind of like an almost like an inner uh, lack, an inner sense of lack, then they will lose that motivation. However, what happens is it's replaced by a different kind of motivation, like wanting to help others, wanting to do the things that make you feel really good, wanting to just a better sense of kind of what your purpose is here in a sense, or um, a feeling that you're more aligned with what your calling is. And so I don't think that's like really a valid concern, because if there is a change, like all the changes that have taken place are positive. It's not like you would ever wish that you had this kind of angst that was driving you before. If there's a change that takes place, it's because there's like an experiential understanding that like this thing I'm doing is making me suffer, even if I thought it was making me happy before. So yeah, I think it's any change in motivation comes from basically understanding in Buddhism what's called the first noble truth, that like this thing I'm doing is actually making me suffer. And and then your life starts to take a more positive direction, even if it's not the one you're currently on. But yeah, it's everything's a choice. It's not like you would ever wish you were doing something that you had were doing before. It's always like uh, I feel better about this path I'm now on.
For sure, for sure. And along the way, you've met this incredible teacher. I think he was it Bhante? Is his name? How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, Bhante. Bhante means monk, so it's actually the kind of title of a lot of different teachers. But his full name was Bhante Vimalaramsi, and this was the Pali name he was given. So he was actually from California. He was growing up. He was like a tall redhead with uh, liked sports and was kind of like in some ways a normal American. And then he went off to Asia for 12 years and did some really intense meditation. And when I met him, he was in his 70s and he'd been a monk for 35 years.
Wow, wow. And one of the things that he recommends is a practice of smiling. Does he recommend smiling as much as you can throughout the day? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Smiling was a big part of his practice. Um, and, eventually in the beginning, it's kind of like this forced training, but what he realized was the smile could actually trigger mindfulness, because you could realize when you're not smiling anymore, your mind has probably gone into a kind of serious and negative state. And then this would be a reminder to become aware again. So for him, it was a big kind of trick on retreat to be more mindful. And he also looked in a little bit to the smiling research. There's been like over 200 studies, like a meta-analysis showed that there is a statistically significant improvement in mood from smiling. So he realized this was one way to bring joy into the practice. One of the things he realized from his own very intensive training, and it's a lesson I had to relearn over and over again, is that especially I think Westerners tend to come at the meditation practice with way too much of a serious mindset. And actually, when you look at the traditional Buddhist texts, it's all about being happy and joyful. And that's the kind of thing that brings us into the present. So a lot of people think if I meditate really hard, then I'll be happy. But actually, being happy brings you into a meditative state. And it's kind of the vehicle to get into these deeper states called jhanas. So this was one way for him um, to get especially more serious meditators to relax and have fun with the practice.
I love that. So like our default assumption is if I meditate more, I'll be happy. But what he's sort of saying is that it's bi-directional. If I'm happier, I'm much more conducive to a meditative state. And I love just this idea, like if you do have a practice of maintaining a smile, then whenever you notice yourself not smiling, it's a way to bring yourself back in the present moment. And as a byproduct of that, smiling, like just having your face in that posture, produces joy as a byproduct. So what a great and simple practice just to bring into your life. Powerful.
Absolutely.
So when you were at King's, you did a master's in applied neuroscience at King's College London. And I think this was actually around the time we had our last conversation. You discovered a grand unifying theory of the brain. Can you maybe just share what this theory was, Liam, and why it's so important?
Yeah. There's a theory that's still not mainstream outside of neuroscience circles called predictive processing. And it's basically viewing the brain as a predictive machine. And one of the reasons this is so important is that for a long time, neuroscience has studied the brain in terms of what does this part of the brain do. Or, for example, a lot of people have heard that the amygdala is associated with emotions, especially negative emotions like fear. But that doesn't really tell us how the brain works. It tells us what a certain part of the brain does. So a lot of the meditation research up to this point has focused on matching parts of the brain with different states of meditation. Like we know when you enter this meditative state, this part of the brain lights up. There's this change, but that doesn't really tell us what's happening. It just kind of matches, almost like almost like just matching parts of the brain with functions, but it's not telling us how the whole brain works. Predictive processing is a theory that it's still theoretical, but it gives us a framework for understanding why the brain is functioning as a whole. And essentially what it says is the brain is building a model of the outside world because there's too much information coming in, too much sensory data for us to constantly be processing each new bit of sensory data. So the shortcut is we have a model of how the world works, and then we make a best guess assumption about what's out there in the quote unquote in the world outside of our skull. And then we test those predictions against the new sensory data that's coming in. And it turns out that this model maps on very well to our understanding of meditation, and how meditation can reduce suffering. And there was a groundbreaking paper by Ruben Laukonen and Helene Slechter, and this is the paper I came across when I was doing some research at King's College London, and I ended up kind of doing my thesis based on their work, which was, in summary, showing that meditators were pruning the higher order predictions, essentially the excess or unnecessary predictions that the brain makes, such as worrying about things that will never happen, such as creating these narratives and stories that are kind of higher order. In other words, they're removed from the sensory data, but they tend to kind of consume our lives. And this uses up a lot of energy, and it takes us out of the present moment. And what they were showing through various different studies. They were kind of compiling a lot of different data on meditators, and especially advanced meditators, that they could actually prune, or in other words, they could eliminate these excess predictions over time with their meditation practice, and not just in the moment, not just while they were meditating, but also as a kind of trait, a long-term change in the brain, that over time, even though they could still think when they needed to, and they could still function very well or even much better in daily life, it turns out that a lot of our thinking and narratives are kind of unnecessary, and it seems like that's also indicated in the brain of advanced meditators.
Wow. So when we meditate for long stretches, we are essentially pruning unnecessary thinking. Like, we're sort of refining our cognitive processing, so we don't waste that mental energy on things that are just going to create suffering in our lives.
Exactly. Yeah, we're becoming more efficient, and it's interesting because this is the report of meditators, that they become that they start to rely on their thoughts less, which might sound a little scary, I think, especially since we're quite trained in the education system, that thinking is what makes us human. It's what makes us. It's where our intelligence comes from. But if you talk to some really advanced meditators, they're operating very intuitively. There's a lot less kind of chewing on repetitive thoughts. And it's not that they wouldn't be able to think very deeply if they needed to, but it's those repeat thoughts, which are most of what we're kind of going through on a day-to-day basis of, what if I miss my train? What if I miss my train? What if I miss my train? That's not helpful. We don't want to be doing that. We want to be enjoying the moment, and maybe we have that thought once that I need to get to my train, but we don't want to keep having that thought when we're already doing the best we can. So yeah, this is like really good news for anyone, that they can eliminate these kind of excess predictions in predictive processing language.
So to try and make this simple and correct where I go wrong here, but are we sort of saying that we don't see the world that is out there? What we're seeing is a combination of sensory inputs from the environment, photons of light, vibrations of air, like these things coming in, and then our brain's best predictions about what caused those signals. So it's sort of like it's this combination of both. And there's a quote from, I think it's William Wordsworth, something like, we half perceive the world and we half create the world. It's these two things at once. Is this what we're saying here?
Yes, exactly. If you think about, the brain doesn't have direct access to the outside world. It's inside your skull, and actually, the brain is kind of, we think about neuroscience as a study of the brain, but it's really our entire nervous system. You can think about the nervous system as it's housing a predictive model of what's outside of your skin, because it needs that information to survive and reproduce, but it doesn't need to know exactly what's out there from a literal standpoint. What it needs is like a shortcut icon of what is that thing out, how is that thing out there useful to me in terms of survival and reproduction. So one analogy that I wrote about in the book was a GPS map. A GPS map would use way too much information. It would be unnecessary if it had a perfect layout of every street and exactly what was on that street, all the trees that were on the side of the road. If it had to record everything that, for example, your eyes would see on the road, all it needs is an icon that represents the road that you're going to go down, and then maybe certain markers for restaurants or whatever destinations you're going to. In some ways, our brain is similar. It's creating a shortcut map of the world that's, I'm saying quote unquote out there, because from a meditation standpoint, experientially, all we really know is that we're having a conscious experience. We don't really know if there's a separation between inner and outer from a first person perspective. But from a neuroscience perspective, the brain is creating a shortcut map of a world outside of the skull, and it is using that information for what it thinks would help our survival and reproduction. So part of the problem is that our modern environment is quite maladapted to the way that the environment in which we evolved for a couple million years, and even longer than that. I mean, the nervous system has been evolving for at least 600 million years. So a lot of its shortcuts are, it's predicting the worst case scenario. It's still thinking in some sense that there could be predators that would eat us, even when we're completely safe, when we're in heated homes with plenty of food, hopefully, for those of us that are fortunate enough. So even when we're in these ideal circumstances, the brain continues to predict as if we're constantly under threat of survival, because those are the predictive models that got passed on from one generation to the next. So in order for us to have peace of mind, we'd like to have a predictive model that is more aligned with a peaceful state of being content and being happy in the present moment. And then, of course, it's still going to get us to our destination. It's still going to, if there's a car coming at us, we're still going to step out of the way. It's just that what we don't want is all the excess narratives where we're trying to write a book, and then our mind is thinking about, oh, I wonder if that friend of mine doesn't like me anymore because they didn't respond to my text. Like, that is an unnecessary prediction where the model is trying to essentially decide or predict how to respond or how to get that person to like us, because it still thinks we're living in a small tribe where if one person that's important to us doesn't like us, that could mean expulsion from the tribe and eventually potentially death or isolation. So our predictive model is really outdated in some ways, and it seems like part of what meditation does is kind of upgrade it so that it's more aligned with well-being.
So interesting. And, you've kind of touched on it there earlier. This idea of the brain almost being like a filter or a filtering valve, in the sense that there's a massive wide spectrum of consciousness, and our brain has been trained over hundreds of millions of years of evolution to tune into a very narrow bandwidth of that spectrum, that only to the information that is going to be relevant to our survival and reproduction. But whenever we meditate, or I don't have a lot of experience with psychedelics, but whenever people take psychedelics, it's almost like you're turning the filter down a little bit, and more of that spectrum of consciousness can get in. And for whatever reason we could speculate on, that is healing for people for some reason. That reduces suffering. To me, that's a very interesting idea. Like, what is coming in there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. If you think about, so there's just billions of bits of information out there in terms of energy that we don't perceive, as you said, that we didn't evolve to perceive, and we perceive through our senses a small fraction of that, and of that small fraction, we begin to build conceptual. We begin to abstract further and further away from the data into these abstract concepts. So, for example, we take the data that's coming in, and then we label it with a concept. So let's say there's like a round object out there that's giving us a certain wavelength of light, and our brain starts to label that as orange light and that round shape as an orange. And then we take that data and we start to associate feelings with it so that we know whether to move closer to it or away from it. So if it's an orange and we like oranges, maybe there's a positive feeling that gets associated with that object. And then on top of that, we start to have thoughts about it. So we might have all sorts of thoughts about what oranges are. If we're hungry, maybe the thought is like, that orange is my lunch. And then on top of those thoughts, we build narratives or stories or beliefs. So maybe we have all sorts of beliefs about the importance of eating organic oranges, or if it was an apple, we might have other like even subconscious associations about Apple Computer and like a brand icon and things like that. So we've taken like a ton of information, we've filtered for a tiny fraction of it, and then we've started to build a mental model that's very abstract and removed from the actual sensory inputs of this wavelength of light and this like shape. And it seems like a lot of those stories that we build are quite negative because they're skewed for survival and reproduction, and so I think a lot of what meditation does is prune the excess narratives, or help us see through them in some ways, help us see the actual sensory inputs that are there, and help us see that the excess predictions basically aren't needed or aren't real in a sense. And it's I'm less of an expert on psychedelics, but it seems like psychedelics also have a sense of rearranging, in a sense, the predictive model, or allowing to see new ways of looking at that same sensory data. It's this model of this framework of predictive processing is very useful for understanding how meditation and psychedelics improve well-being.
For sure. And something you said in the book, which I think is just worth elaborating on, maybe you've already touched on it, but understanding predictive processing can almost help us give our brain like a software upgrade. What did you mean whenever you said that?
Yeah, the software upgrade is it's both processing information more efficiently, so having less of these abstract narratives and thoughts that are again tend to be negative, and also in a sense more control over the predictive model, in a sense that when we notice that we're beginning to think or have narratives that aren't useful, we can release them, and we can choose a new narrative or a more positive way of looking at it. Those are the it's kind of a summary of what I've been talking about, it, and also the findings of Dr. Laukkonen and Dr. Slegter and their research on advanced meditators, that they, in a sense, have more control over their predictive models.
Beautiful. Can you tell us about the Harvard Medical School study on the practice of jhana meditation? This essentially, am I right in saying that it uses bliss to reprogram the mind? Could you just share a little bit about this study and this method of meditation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this goes back to what we were talking about towards the beginning of this kind of positive feedback loop of joy and deep meditative state, which creates more joy, which gets us into a deeper meditative state. Jhana is a Pali term that was used by the Buddha, and the historical Buddha in the kind of early Buddhist text called the Pali Canon, to describe a state of meditation where your mind is free from hindrances, or basically these large prediction errors in predictive processing terms, or we could think about them as like worries and doubts and things that are pulling your mind away from the present moment. So jhana is it's a term used in Buddhist meditation for a state of concentration or collectedness, where your mind is fully in the present moment, and it also has certain factors like joy and happiness. And there's progressive stages of jhana. So in the first jhana, there's a lot of joy coming up because your mind has let go of the things that were pulling it away, and it feels very good because it feels like everything is exactly as it should be in the present moment. And then even that joy, initial joy, becomes a little too heavy because the mind would actually prefer to be peaceful or in equanimity. And so there's stages of unfolding as the mind starts to get calmer and calmer, and the kind of ripples start to calm down, and the small kind of proto thoughts or the beginnings of a thought start to fade away. And so this is also a controversial term in Buddhist circles, because some teachers interpret it. There's actually many different interpretations. Some interpret it as a state of concentration, where, for example, you would focus on the tip of your nose at the nostrils and focus on your breath in a very concentrated way until everything else falls away and you're in these very deep, blissful states. The way that Bhante Vimalaramsi, my teacher, interpreted it through his years of practice and having explored those other states was that it seems the Buddha was actually talking about a state where your awareness is completely open and relaxed. So your mind is open, but it's not distracted. And so it's hard to describe this because it's more of an experience. But basically, your mind is unified. It's not distracted by anything, but it's also completely, it's not narrowly focused on one object. It's gotten there by relaxing and releasing the things that were pulling it away. And then it's just kind of resting, content in the present moment. And it turns out these states of jhana can be studied neuroscientifically, that they do produce very noticeable changes in the brain. And there's a kind of pioneering or a series of pioneering studies at Harvard Medical School through the meditation research program that I got to participate in, where and that data is still coming out, but it seems this is a very kind of profound and significant altered state. And I think a lot of the purpose of this research was both to clarify from an academic standpoint the different types of jhana, and that this is like something that really exists, and to show neuroscientifically the correlates of jhana and what might be happening in the brain.
Wow. And so there's 4 steps to your teacher's method: recognize, release, relish, and remain. Can you just kind of give us the big picture overview here, Liam, and what each of these steps mean in practice?
Yeah, so this is the framework for meditating, and it actually comes from, my teacher had 6 R's, which are recognize, release, relax, resmile, return, and repeat. And I've simplified it into 4 R's in the book, and just for kind of ease of memory, and also because this maps on really well to the 4 right efforts in Buddhism, which I won't go into now. But just to briefly describe each of these, recognizing is the first step in meditation, where you recognize what's happening in your mind, and specifically you recognize when your mind has gone into an unfit state. And an unfit state means there's negative thoughts, there's negative feelings, and you're identifying with them. So, for example, let's say you're listening to a podcast, and all of a sudden, a couple minutes later, you kind of wake up in a sense, and you realize that your mind has, on autopilot, just started ruminating and thinking about an argument that you had with your spouse. And so maybe it's been doing that for a couple of minutes, and you wake up and you recognize, my goodness, I don't even remember what's been said in the podcast. I've been thinking about this argument. So that's the first step, is to become what's called meta-aware of what's happening in your mind. The next step is to release, which is to essentially accept what's happening. You're not trying to push it away, but you accept it, and you relax and you release any physical tension in your body. And that helps you just kind of disidentify with that unfit state. And then the relish step is to actually...
Sorry, just to clarify, the recognized state, are you kind of doing an active search within your body to find where that tension is? And then whenever you do notice it, like, what does it mean to let go of it? Are you just relaxing? Like, what does it actually feel and look like in practice?
Yeah, one way that I like to give people a sense for this is if they put their finger in front of them, and don't do this if you're driving. You could try it later. But if you put one finger in front of you, and you focus all of your attention on the tip of the finger, and you try to block out everything else, you can feel like there's a tension especially in the forehead area. It's pretty subtle, but this is kind of what it feels like when your mind has latched onto a negative thought. And and then if you just relax your gaze now and open to your peripheral awareness, so your fingers still in your line of sight, but you've now relaxed and you're letting in your surroundings. And if you just go back and forth a couple of times between really staring and focusing hard on the tip of your finger, and then relaxing your gaze, and also relaxing any tension in your forehead area, you can feel there's this kind of relief. And that's kind of what it feels like when you let go of a distraction, where your mind is really hyper focused on this and caught up in ruminating and mulling over this thing. And then the moment you recognize that, and it's almost like relaxing and opening a fist, you can actually feel there's a tension that's often in the forehead area. Um, and if you just take a second to relax that tension, it kind of lets go of the craving, it lets go of the unfit state. And then the next two steps are about bringing in a positive state, which is like smiling. It's coming to a wholesome or a positive feeling like gratitude. And then remain is to remain with that positive feeling, which kind of keeps us in the present moment. And these are actually the four right efforts in Buddhism. There's four steps to right effort. Right effort is not about concentrating hard and like yanking your mind back to an object every time it wanders away. It's about recognizing and releasing the negative state, and then relishing and remaining with a positive, joyful feeling. And over time, we're training the mind to be in that positive, or what I call a fit state, more often.
I love it. Love it. Did you ever get a chance when you were learning from Bhante to ask him, or did he ever share anything about grief and the grieving process? Like, any thoughts here?
Yes, Bhante talked a lot about grief and other negative states, and how to handle them. One of basically the he had two main practices. One was the one I'm describing, which is it actually was a loving kindness practice that leads into jhana, and then using the 6 R's or the 4 R's to go deeper and deeper into the meditation. The other was forgiveness meditation, which is a way of letting go of larger emotional blocks. And so the way he described um, prolonged states such as grief or depression is basically, these are feelings that are coming up, um, and the way to handle them is basically not to identify with them, but to um, see them as, these are just feelings. They're not mine. Like, I didn't ask them to come up. Um, and then to begin to forgive whatever it was that's underlying this emotional turbulence. Often we have to forgive ourselves. I spent like weeks forgiving myself for things that I didn't even know I was holding against myself. And then almost everyone has people in their lives that that for one reason or another that they can work on forgiving. And yeah, the transformations I saw in retreats, and sitting in on interviews with others who were doing this practice, and also in myself, was quite profound. That once I let go of whatever was underlying it, there was just a lot of lightness and joy, and it was like setting down a very heavy backpack that I'd been carrying around subconsciously. So yeah, I can go into more of that practice if you'd like, but that's the gist of it.
And for someone at home listening to this, and they would like to forgive themselves for something, how would you recommend specifically they engage in this process? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, there's two ways to go about it. Um, one is the forgiveness meditation practice that Bhante recommended, and you can read about this in my book. It's also on the free FitMind meditation app where I kind of guide you through it. But in essence, you use a phrase such as "I forgive myself for not understanding," and you begin by directing it towards yourself, and then other people will often come up in your mind, and the phrase will change to "I forgive you for not understanding," and you'll picture that person and just have the intention of forgiving them. A lot of meditation is about just intending and then so you're not forcing anything to happen. You're not if tears come, that's a really good sign of a relief and letting go. But basically picturing that person and continuing every 30 seconds or so with the phrase, "I forgive you for not understanding," and then just feeling that intention and feeling that that feeling of forgiveness towards the person. And then eventually there can be a kind of release or relief as you let go of whatever it was. So that's one way. The other way, which I also talk about in more detail, is the method of releasing, which I call combat training. And this is basically a way of letting go of the negative energy very efficiently. So you would this is one way of doing it. You would picture the person or the incident in your mind. You would get in touch with that feeling in your body, which is often a contraction or a tension in your chest area or your stomach area. You bring your attention there and you mentally open a window and imagine that negative energy or that tension as a kind of black smoke that's just floating out of the window, and you're mentally keeping the window open. You're letting go of the negative energy, which is visually coming out as black smoke, and you can, for example, you could begin this practice by rating yourself on a scale of 100 to 0. How upset am I? So let's say it's pretty bad. You're very angry at this person or incident. Maybe you're an 80% out of 100. It's just whatever number intuitively comes to mind. And then after releasing this energy, you can feel yourself moving down to like a 50, 40, 30, and eventually you'll get to a point, which could be after just a few minutes, or it could be after a few hours of practicing this, but eventually you'll get to a point where there's no feelings, there's no negative energy left. And at that point, you have truly forgiven the person, and you can feel love for them. You can feel, okay, it's not that I'm condoning what they did, or it's not that I want this person in my life, or it's not that I think this incident was okay, but inside I feel okay about it now. And I feel that it's not going to weigh me down anymore. I'm not going to be thinking about it when I want to be doing something else or in the present. So those are two ways of forgiving, because I think we often hear about, like in the anyone who's read like a spiritual book or practiced positive psychology, that we should forgive and we should be loving and kind. But when it comes to actually practicing it, it's like, all right, I want to let go, but how do I let go? And what Bhante really taught me with the forgiveness meditation, and what I've learned with the releasing practice, or what I'm calling combat training, is how to actually let go of these feelings in a very efficient way of letting go and feeling the relief of it.
So you're identifying the sensations, and then you're sort of visualizing it as, do you say, like a black smoke, and then you're just visualizing, then just letting that go? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So, and there's another way of letting go that would take a little longer to describe for people who are less visual. And again, I talk about this. There's a module in the app called Combat Training that goes in where I guide people through this. But the gist of the one I just described is that you get in touch with the feeling, often in the chest area or the stomach area, and you visually or mentally open, you're mentally visualizing a window opening. And then this energy that is kind of a tension or a congestion in there, which is actually the feeling that we're labeling as like, I'm angry or I'm depressed or I'm grieving, that energy can be visualized as a black smoke floating out of the window. And just the intention to open the window and just kind of let that energy out is often enough. You just keep the window open and you keep letting go. Another thing that can help is to keep saying yes, mentally keep saying yes to that feeling. Because what we're often doing is we're suppressing the feeling. We're suppressing it, or we're expressing it as like anger and doing something that we'll regret later. So we spend a lot of time pushing the feeling down. And what this does is you actually say yes to it, and you open and and uh, and let it out. And it turns out that the feeling won't come back when you let go of a feeling around an issue in this way. It won't. If it comes back, it's just there's more. There's a deeper layer that needs to release. But eventually, you'll be completely clear when you think about that topic.
Wow, this is powerful. And for you personally, do you remember what this felt like after you had done this work? Like, was there a sense of lightness? Like, what was it? What was it like for you after having done this?
Yeah, just immense relief and joy. And yeah, I mean, the thing is, I've done like many months of it. And I remember when Bhante first gave me the practice, I thought I was done after like 3 days. I thought, oh, that's great. I'm clear. My life, I've been very fortunate. There haven't been any large traumatic incidents. And so I thought, okay, that's it. I'm done. Now let's get back to like the real meditation practice. And like a week later, he put me back on more forgiveness. And I was so like, I was almost ashamed. I thought, oh, he thinks I'm a total beginner. And then, sure enough, like a few minutes later, I was just crying and laughing, walking on the road. I didn't even know what I was forgiving myself for. It was just some kind of feeling that was there, some kind of self-resentment. And now, as I've stuck with the practice, I've realized that this is like almost like a lifetime project. Although I think someone who's really focused could go through their all of their incidents in a few months if they were just doing it like nonstop. But like we've all got a lot of stuff in there to forgive. And the great thing about this is that you feel immediate relief. It's not like you have to wait like months to start feeling happier. It's like with your very first release, you start feeling the joy. But it's a practice, and there's often more layers. There's often more things that come up that we didn't even know was kind of suppressed in our subconscious. But with each relief, you start to feel lighter and more joyful and more energized. And the other thing that becomes clear is that the reason that many people are weighed down and lacking energy is that they're hanging on to so much subconscious baggage that it's just pulling them down. It's all these large prediction errors that are unresolved from like decades ago, from whatever it was, the divorce or the bullying incident in middle school or whatever it was that's weighing them down subconsciously. So you can start to see for yourself the immediate relief and shift in energy when you let go of these things. And it's also made sense to me why some meditators were just like so naturally gifted at the practice that would come on retreat and they're just immediately in these deep states. And over time, initially I thought it was how much experience they had or how much effort they were putting in. And over time, I realized it's these people that seemed to be really gifted. Their hearts were just more open. They had less baggage. They'd done this work at some point, in this life, they'd accumulated less kind of emotional baggage. And then others like myself had to have like a lot of things to work through, but it's really worthwhile. Like there's nothing more rewarding, I think, than letting go of these things.
For sure, for sure. Okay, maybe one question now just to wrap up, Liam. For someone, no, actually, I was going to ask a general question. Maybe we can do both. The first question I was going to ask was, for someone home listening to this, are there any practices, like if you could only recommend one practice in addition to what we've already spoke today, that would have a really outsized positive effect on their lives, what would that be? And then I'll ask the next one after.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so just to summarize the two that I've talked about, and people can learn more about this in the book on the app, and they can also just Google it if they want to. There's a lot of guided meditations, and Dhammasukha, which is the monastery and meditation center that I trained at, has free online retreats, and the in-person retreats there in Missouri are also quite affordable. So the Dhammasukha teaches TWIM meditation, tranquil wisdom, insight meditation, and also forgiveness. Forgiveness meditation is the other practice we discussed. So those two, and then the other one I've talked about is what I call combat training, which is also called the Sedona method. Although what I'm teaching is, I think, closer to the original. I think the way it's taught now, and there's like a kind of, some of those classes are expensive, but if somebody wants to learn this technique on YouTube, they can also search 1992 Sedona method course. And there's a series of 8 videos that will take them in depth about letting go. And so those 3 are the most powerful practices that I found, and those are the 3 that I discuss in the book for that reason. If I had to add a fourth to that, the other daily practice I have is called Flying Phoenix Qigong, and it's something you can Google and learn more about. But it's a very powerful Qigong practice that involves a breath control sequence, which triggers a certain flow of energy. Experientially, you start to feel a certain energy circulate, and then postures that are specifically designed to circulate that energy with each breath control sequence. And it's very energizing. It's very relaxing, and it's something you can kind of build into your daily routine that I think is a good complement to these other meditation practices.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, and last question, just on a personal note, as you're kind of reintegrating back into life, what directions do you feel are important? What do you feel pulled towards now? Like, do you think much about the future? Like, what do you feel pulled towards at this moment in your life, would you say?
Well, a few things come to mind. In terms of my personal life, I just think it's important to have a balanced lifestyle with a good support network of family and friends, and a community. And I really came to value community living when I was in a monastery, and I realized that mental fitness, or the meditation practice, is really a lifestyle, and a big part of it is having a relatively simple and balanced life, and surrounding yourself with people who are helping you cultivate fit states, or these kind of positive, wholesome states of mind. So I spend a lot of time in nature, running, paddleboarding. I just went surfing this past weekend, so I really enjoy getting into nature and unplugging for periods of time. And in terms of like professionally, or in terms of my work with FitMind, I really feel called to help people, and especially these three methods that I just talked about, to really spread these, because I feel like they've helped me so much that it's in some ways my calling, or my responsibility, to help more people have access to these. And so soon I plan to start having in-person meditation retreats. I'd like to host my first meditation retreat. And not to put myself on a pedestal as like a big teacher, I'm still practicing as well, but just as a guide who's kind of made a lot of mistakes, and feel like I can help others avoid those mistakes. And also just to kind of continue to cultivate a community of meditators with FitMind. Because really my goal with FitMind is to bring a deep meditation practice to as many people as I can. I feel like meditation is now pretty mainstream, but what there could be more of is deep meditation, in terms of people who are essentially trying to make it a main focus of their life, where they're meditating all day, where they're forgiving everything that needs to be forgiven, where they're releasing everything that needs to be released, where they're getting, where their jhana becomes part of their daily lifestyle. And that's kind of the future that I envision, is like a community where people are practicing those things together. And so, yeah, the long-term vision with FitMind is to really continue to cultivate community and resources for people to freely access these amazing techniques that have just completely changed my life.
Incredible. They say to write a great book, or I think it's Naval Ravikant said this, to write a great book, you must become the book. And when I speak with you, you have become everything that you talk about in FitMind. You're an embodiment of the work, which is just so powerful, and why it makes your message so strong. Where can people, where would you send them after this conversation? Where would you recommend them getting the book? Where can they connect with you online? Where would you send people?
Yeah, thank you. Well, they can get the book. I think it's available pretty much everywhere that most books are sold. And it's called FitMind, with a space, Fit Space Mind, 4 Steps to Lasting Bliss, Neuroscience and Meditation for Daily Life. And in terms of where I'd send them next, I think it's great to start a regular meditation practice, or if you already have one, to deepen your practice. As I mentioned, the FitMind app is freely available. It's donation-based. So FitMind's a nonprofit, and the FitMind app is FitMind, one word, and it's available in the App Store on Google and Android and Apple App Store. And yeah, I'm not really online or on social media, but I think if you sign up for the FitMind newsletter, maybe that's the best way to stay in touch on our website, fitmind.org. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the podcast. It's so good to see you again after like 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, you too, man. You too. Okay, we'll end there.
All right, thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.